Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Webinar Series. My name is Alex Condon, and I'm the COO and co-founder of Galen Data, and I'm going to be your host for today. Today, we're joined by Frank Jaskulke, Vice President of Sales and Business Development at Avio Medtech Consulting, who will be discussing the 10 common mistakes he sees medtech companies make in their go-to-market journey. First, we have a few housekeeping items before we start and a little information on Galen Data. So Galen Data provides an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. We're ISO 13485 certified, and the product on AWS is HITRUST certified as well. Galen was founded by a seasoned medical device group of professionals with the goal to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off development timelines. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not morph into IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics. So as we're going through this, if you have any questions at all, feel free to type those in the Q&A section available on the sidebar, either to your left or your right, depending on where you're looking and how your screen is configured. We will ask those questions to the guest at the end, or if appropriate, if we don't have any time or whatever it is, we'll follow up with you after the webinar terminates to get those answers over to you. There are some handouts on Galen in the control panel with some more information, a couple white papers and a couple kind of data sheets that you can feel free to download. And also a reminder that a copy of this webinar will be sent to you guys via email at its conclusion. That being said, I'd like to introduce our guest, Frank Jaskulke. Welcome, Frank, and I will let you take it over from here.
Thank you, Alex. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the partnership with Galen to get my screen sharing going here. So folks, just give me a second. Get that up. You tell me if that don't look right. Well, good afternoon, good morning. Perfect. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where we find you dialing into this webinar. My name is Frank Jaskulke. I'm going to go through a presentation, and please do put in your questions. We'll try to get to those by the end of this, and if not, as Alex said, we'll follow up. I want to say first, a thanks to Galen for being a great partner to me over the years, for being a great partner to the med device community and ecosystem. We should all feel fortunate that there are people who care enough to do the hard work to try to make your work a little bit easier, and that's what I'm signed up for as well. So as I'm going through this, I'm going to be talking about 10 things that in the time I've been working in this industry, I see happen over and over and over again. I suspect for many of you on this call who are professionals, you've done this, you've maybe started companies before, some of these are going to look familiar. Maybe you've made some of these mistakes before, maybe you're making them now, or maybe you're not going to make any of them. It's just that in my experience, working with startups now for 20 years, I've seen these things happen over and over again, even from serial successful entrepreneurs. It's not that they're doing all 10, but they're missing one or two and it's slowing them down, it takes more money, and it reduces the chances that they're ultimately going to benefit patients and get to market. And look, just about Avio real quick, we get it. Startups are hard. Everything you are doing is high risk. And I've always felt very honored to just be around people like you who take that risk to try to make something better. Avio is a medtech consulting firm founded by a medtech entrepreneur, founded by one of your peers to try to make your work a bit easier. If we can ever be of any service, please do reach out. But with that, I'll stop the pitch and talk about the challenges that we see most commonly. And the one that I see hands down, power law distribution, most common is failure to validate that there is a market need for what is being built. Often the companies are looking at, is there an unmet clinical need? But they're not digging in to find out if it's unmet for a reason. Is there not a business case that can be made to solve that clinical problem? Not all clinical problems are business problems. They're not digging into if it's something that's differentiated or if it's just different, right? There's lots of different ways I could test for something or treat something. Do I need another way? And They're often not digging into if the market is large enough and profitable enough to build a business and at what scale. It's not that small markets are bad, it's that you're building a different kind of business and that you're then going to have a different financing and regulatory and go to market and clinical and all that other strategy. And it ends up being that a lot of what you do at the front end to validate the market drives all the other decisions that you're going to make. So if you don't get this one at least close to right, you end up having a lot more challenges with everything else. So what do you got to do? Well, you got to dig into it. You have to understand not only the unmet clinical need, but the business case. And that's going to mean the payment side, the adoption side, the workflow, the clinical needs, what levels of evidence are going to be required. Build into your entire plan to go to market the market. Far too often, there's just an assumption that because there's an unmet clinical need and there's a technology that could address it, therefore there is a business. The second one that I see a lot on is kind of cheaping on regulatory. And I don't mean this as companies don't do what is required to get FDA authorization. Rather, they're not connecting that market need to their regulatory strategy. So, a classic example is you may be able to get regulatory clearance without needing a clinical trial. But if you're in a market where the payers and the providers are going to require some form of new evidence before they'll use the product, you're going to run into challenges. There's a big difference between market authorization or the right to sell and having what is needed to drive adoption. Quite often I'll hear companies talk about, a minimally viable product, an MVP, and they're very focused on minimum and they forget about viable. If your goal is to sell product and help patients, then you need to know what do the buyers need to buy your product. And in doing that regulatory work early on, it should be integrating with your clinical strategy, your reimbursement strategy, and your sales and marketing strategy so that you make decisions about each that reinforce each other, as opposed to simply doing the bare minimum to get market authorization and realizing no one wants to buy your product. The third one, and very related, is the idea of insufficient evidence. That depending on what stakeholder you're engaging with, they may have different standards for the amount and the kind of evidence they're going to need to make a decision that's in your favor. I'm often reminded that in the payer world, the large payers are quite a bit bigger than the device industry. So as an example, United Health Group this year will do over 350 billion in revenue. They will add 40 billion in revenue over last year. That is bigger as a company than the entire US medical device industry, and they will add more revenue than Medtronic did in the prior year. Why does that matter? Well, when they're looking at new opportunities or new technologies that they might pay for or they might bring into their large hospital network, they want a very different kind of evidence and a very different level of evidence than what a smaller payer or a small health system might need. Why? Because United's thinking about how is this going to impact 10 million people or 20,000 doctors. So if you're going to be doing a product without a clinical trial, or if you're going to be developing a new device, early on you should be understanding what those stakeholders need for their level of evidence to drive adoption. And that goes back to that market validation piece. Next one, and our friends at Galen certainly can help you quite a bit in this area with their technology, but increasingly data security and compliance is coming up. Almost every med device today is a connected device or a digital device, even some that it's surprising that there's connections. And the amount of connectivity going into hospitals has meant the requirements around security are only growing. I think we all get this, that cybersecurity matters, but if you're not doing the work early on in your product development process, you may be baking in non-secure components or making your work a lot harder to prove that you have a secure product. The other side of it is once you get to market, you can end up spending a lot of time doing security audits with the hospitals that might be buying your product. If you can develop good systems up front, have good documentation, use best practices, you can save a ton of time on the sales and marketing side And that's something that if you go to sell your company might come up in due diligence. When you're going to raise capital, it's certainly going to come up. You can do things that will speed your time to sale early on by making sure you're using good partners and using best practices early on. The next one I see quite often, especially with new medical devices, is discounting the cost of change. So if you bring a new product to market, if it doesn't fit into an existing clinical workflow, you're asking someone to make a change. And if you've ever tried, say, like a new year, to have a New Year's resolution and you want to exercise more, save more money, make a new habit, you get how hard change is. And if you're now asking a doctor to change, a nurse to change, a payer to pay for something new, a hospital to buy something new, you're asking for a lot of change to happen in organizations that in many cases are resource constrained, right? Every hospital is broke right now. The payers, even when they have lots of money coming in, don't want to spend it. And now you're asking them to do something new. My observation has been far too few companies think about how they're going to make it easy for their end users to switch from what they're doing before to the new thing that the organization is proposing. One of the ways to approach this is to be very niche, solve what is seemingly a small problem, but is a huge pain in the butt for someone, and that they're willing to do the work to carry it through and help you drive adoption. The other side, I think, is to be big and transformative, something where value of making that change is so significant that it's worthwhile. Where I think companies get in trouble is when they're kind of in between. It's a lot of change relative to being provided. Former boss might used to say, in the old days, you could get paid a premium price for incremental improvements. Today, you need a premium improvement to just not get your price cut. No surprise, insufficient capital comes up a lot, right? And it is a real problem. If you're a startup, you're probably broke even when you got money. You're always capital constrained. One of the problems that I often see with this, though, is that as leaders of companies, the argument is made that the market is too tough, the VCs are too diverse, and these are things that are in your control. Often, what's happening is those other challenges that are laid out before are now coming to bite. The regulatory strategy doesn't look robust for what the product is. The market doesn't seem big enough. Maybe it is, but I don't believe the story that you're telling me. If you have those other pieces in place, if you identify a real market that is venture scalable, if you show a roadmap to get to market that is reasonable and thoughtful and overcomes the challenges of driving adoption, has sufficient evidence for the type of product you're in, there are investors who want to listen. If you're not doing those things, what ends up happening quite often is companies find a little bit of money, do a little bit of work, find a little bit of money, do a little bit of work, but they don't make progress, really drive their innovation forward and create value in the asset that is going to attract other investors. Even more so, they're not showing investors that they're a team capable of executing and thus are trustworthy to put that capital into. The corollary to this is I also see a lot of companies where they're great companies, there's a great market opportunity, but it's not a venture scalable opportunity. So it may be a good business, but it needs a different mechanism of financing. Quite often, venture capital, especially the larger funds, they need to see a company that has a reasonable pathway to significant revenue, maybe $100 million in revenue over a relatively short period of time post FDA. Why? Because the math of a venture fund, they need to generate significant returns from the small deals. They know many of them aren't going to work out. And to do that, the company's got to be in a big enough market with a pathway to get to big enough revenue to sell to a strategic or to go at a high enough price. And if you have a great technology and a great market that you can be very capital efficient with, that could be a great company, but it may not be a venture capital backable company. Okay, align the financing strategy. It might be grant funding and angel funding, partnering with strategics, finding micro VCs, or if you've got that big market that you can rapidly grow into, then VCs might be the right thing. But I see a lot of companies where they spend time and energy and conference registration fees going after a set of investors that represent less than 1% of all business capital in the United States that's not aligned to the sort of business that you've been building. And so when I meet the companies that are struggling to raise capital, which right, we all are, it is a challenge. I don't want to discount how hard it truly is. But the things I see is they don't understand how the VCs or the investors work. How does it make money? Know them as a customer, right? They're running a business, they're trying to generate a return. How is your business going to enable their business? The second one often is they have a team that doesn't have credibility with the investment community, right? They're investing in a team, a technology, and a market. Quite often I'll see companies that they figured out a technology, maybe they figured out the market, but they haven't put a team together that inspires the ability to execute that. If they give you money, you're going to spend that money well, create value to get to the next round and to get to market. There are things you can do to establish that credibility by knowing what is in, or what is required to get to market, by having an understanding of the end users. And even very simple things like having professional looking materials. It's such a stupid little thing, but the number of times I see a website or a slide deck where there are errors all over it, there's information that's missing or is different in one slide or another, it probably doesn't mean you're actually not doing a good job, but it gives pause. It gives them a reason to go, maybe I need to look at something else. And it's such an easy thing for you to fix. And then the next one I see, especially for very early stage startups and working with a number of like technical founders or first time founders, is underestimating the cost of being on market. Sales is expensive, right? You've done a ton of work to get the product to market and it feels like you've made it. And in many ways you have. It's a major accomplishment. But now there's a whole nother mountain to climb in driving sales, and sales is expensive, right? If you have a really good sales rep, they're going to get paid a lot of money. And you're going to be happy about that because they're going to be making you a lot of money. If you have a distribution strategy, well, distributors got to eat too. They've got to take a nice chunk of that sale to fund their operations. And on top of that, you got to drive marketing. You got to support the distributors or support the reps. Inventory as a cost, like just existing, right? You talk about burn rate, but once you go into manufacturing product, holding inventory, where now you've put cash out and it's going to be a while before you're getting cash in, you start to appreciate how expensive being a commercial company can become. I'm always a fan of go look at like small publicly traded medical device companies that are commercial, and you'll often see a 7, 8, 9, or 10 to 1 ratio between what they're spending on sales and marketing related costs and what they're spending on R&D related costs. Right? It's because that commercial stage is so expensive. But what can you do? I think one of the good strategies, it's not the only one, is leveraging the power of a limited market release. Early on, you're going to make mistakes and you want to make those mistakes small and cheaply. A limited market release is one way of doing that. What that means is don't launch nationally or don't launch in a bunch of places. It might be one rep or even you as a founder going out and making initial sales, targeting one doc or one hospital, going through the process, generating a little bit of revenue, but more importantly, generating a ton of knowledge and a ton of experience so that when you go to hire rep two, you make fewer mistakes, they get up to productivity faster, you build credibility in the team and their ability to execute, which makes it easier to attract capital, and you replicate that. You go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 6 to 12, on and on until you've taken over the world. But that way, any mistakes you're making are made early and at low cost, not on a 30 rep force deployed across the country that now has a ton of inventory and you've got to retool, but you're out of cash and you can't retool. deducting reimbursement comes up a lot, and you'd think for how much as an industry we've talked about this, it would be better appreciated and addressed. And I think the reason it comes up a lot, or why it's still such a challenge for the industry, is that by and large in the medical device industry, we're thinking about ourselves as being at the center of things. We're not thinking about the role that the payers and the providers play in this other than as the ones who pay for our products and use our products. And I say this as, prior to doing the work I do now, worked very closely with payers, providers, and the medical technology community. And the payers were always quick to remind us that by and large, they barely knew the device industry existed. Why? It goes back to the United Health Group comment earlier. The payers are so big that the problems they need to deal with are 20, 30, $50 billion at a time. So when a device company would say, I want to meet with you to talk about my product, and my product is addressing $1 billion market, we think that's big. To the payers, they go, well, that's like 4 hours of our existence. What do we do for the other 2,000 plus hours in a year? And that is where early on doing that work to prove there's not only a clinical need, but a business need, that you've done the right regulatory work, you have the appropriate clinical evidence, and you've shown that it has a low cost of change, starts to really pay off. Because if you can make it easier for the payers to see value in what you're doing, getting to payment, not just coding and coverage, but ultimately to payment, is going to be a lot easier. So the first place you got to start is really that payers do care about clinical improvements. They really do want to see medicine get better, and that is the first thing they start with. But they're very skeptical of the claims we all make. If you took every device company and all the claims of improvement, clinical improvement and cost savings, then no one should die and our healthcare should be free. And yet, it is not. Why? Because quite often what we find on the bench or in our head or in small clinical studies doesn't bear out when a product gets deployed into the real world with a wide range of clinicians and a wide range of patients. And that's what the payer is paying for. They don't get to pay for what happened in the clinical study, they are paying for what happens in the real world. So if you're going to get them to come on board and to really get behind your product, actually drive adoption of it, not just be a burden, like truly payers can drive adoption if they see value, then you need to understand that their incentives, the things they're measured on, and tell a story about how your product amplifies those and makes them better, and have evidence that is really tied to the real world of medicine that they're paying for. If you can do that, the payer can actually become an ally. If you don't do that, then you have the multi-year challenges, the funds, the fight, trying to get new codes, trying to develop coverage policies, trying to get payment, and that you can do it, but it can be much easier. And that is it. Those are the challenges I see most often. I'll stop sharing the screen, stop talking at you, and just say thank you for taking a few minutes out of your day to listen to me speak, and I'll be glad to answer any questions there might be.
Absolutely, and we have quite a few that come in. One thing that I think would be good, you know, at Galen Data, we deal with kind of companies at all levels of maturity, right? A lot of them
Mhm.
being the startup company that has, kind of all kinds of issues. Maybe it's a first time
Mhm.
founder. Medtech can be a very difficult kind of environment to launch a product, obviously, not just from the funding aspects, all of the different valleys of death they have to suffer, and any kind of clinical evidence that might come in negatively that have to kind of go back to the drawing board. One of the things that I thought was so great about Avio was how you can help shepherd a lot of those companies through that process. And when you
Mm.
first started, I appreciate kind of being light on the pitch, but I think it might benefit a lot of the companies that are listening today. Could you kind of give maybe a little bit longer pitch about, what you're doing these days and how you can kind of help some of the companies? Because I really think that you fill a gap that
Yeah.
we haven't seen a lot of other places try to fill.
Yeah, thank you. The model we've set up, I think a lot of it as I like taglines. So the one I've been thinking a lot about is you as the entrepreneurs, you're inventing the future, but you don't need to invent the process to get there. Uh, every device has its unique things. There's a unique path to market, but there's also a lot of things that are fundamental and are in common. And what we've been building is the capability to partner with you, come alongside you, be your co-pilot from idea on a napkin, from concept all the way to commercialization, and help you do that process right. So partnering with your team in some ways, almost like a mini or fractional COO, to take your concept and figure out what's the market, what's the pathway to market, build a development roadmap, go through the phases of product development efficiently, find the right partners, do the appropriate regulatory submissions, but leverage that we have a team that's done it over and over and over again. And after each client, we're taking learnings and using that to build new templates, build new automations, build new systems so that the next client is even more efficient, right? So you as the entrepreneur, you're inventing the future, but you don't need to reinvent the process. And kind of akin to what you said about Galen at the start, right? Like we want them to be medical device companies, not process management companies or project management companies. And we're doing that in, it's program management for the R&D programs. It's your writing, your quality work. But then we're also pairing that with a team we call the thought partners who are helping on go-to-market strategy, corporate partnering, fundraising. So pairing the technical and the business in service of entrepreneurs and only for startups.
Fantastic. Some of those startups have questions that they've entered through the chat, and
Oh,
we
wonderful.
have kind of a list of them here that I've been tossing up. The very
Please.
first one that came in um, says, "Please come and see how would you determine the right requirements for a first product, i.e., an MVP?"
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot about like in minimally viable product and MVP, we often focus on minimum and not enough on viable. And viable is defined by the market. Um, it's defined by the stakeholders. And this is a small thing and a huge thing. You as an entrepreneur, you're trying to build your company, but it's for someone and you've got to get in their shoes. So I think the way you figure out those requirements is identify the stakeholders who are going to have to be involved and the decisions for your product ultimately to be used. And that might be the doctors and the patients, but it might also be a hospital VAC committee, a payer, supply chain partner. Like, figure out who those organizations are, understand what their incentives are, how are they measured, how are they managed, what matters to them, and then flow that information into building out the user requirements, right? So clearly you need to solve for the clinical need, but to solve for the clinical need, your product has to be bought and put into use. So identify those stakeholders, figure out what matters to them, and start mapping that to your user requirements.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer. Thank you. We have another one that's come in. This is actually from a friend of Galen Data's. Shout out to Dwayne Mancini. Dwayne Mancini, he has the Project Medtech Startup Symposium
Dwayne,
is coming here to Houston in November. I believe it's November 19th and 20th. Galen Data will be there. Looking forward to that very much, Dwayne. And Dwayne had a question that he was hoping you would cover. Let me read it here. A lot of startups run into
mhm,
issues with raising capital because they don't want to raise
mhm.
too much money because of dilution to themselves. This is oftentimes a trap because no one ever died of dilution, but they do run out of money. How do you coach startups around this potential mental block and help them understand that taking on some extra capital isn't a bad thing?
Right on. First of all, Dwayne, good to hear from you. Those of you who don't know Project MedTech, you should go look them up. Fantastic group of people. Um, it's a really good point, right? No one's ever died of delusion. I think as humans, we are optimists by nature, and so we're very hopeful that we'll have all of this equity in this thing that's going to be worth $1 billion. And sometimes that does happen. It's not the most likely or probable outcome. I go back to this idea of, what are you trying to get to, and what is required to get there? Um, don't think about the fundraising or the product development as a series of discrete steps. It is a process from start to finish. And if you have a sense of what is needed to get all the way to the end, and you have an understanding of what the market considers the milestones in value creation, you can structure then your partnerships, your deals, your supplier relationships in ways that follow those phases and maximize your value at each one. Where I see companies, get hung up on this, and where I think, Dwayne, you've probably seen this as well, is if they're not thinking about not just the next step, but the step after that and the step after that, they're really focused on what's happening right now and how much they're giving up today. And they're not thinking about the value that's going to be created next step after that, and all the way to the end. And that maybe you give up more today, but that puts you in a stronger position and you don't have to give up as much later on. So my suggestion would be, don't get hung up on this exact moment. Think about the total picture and what is required, and then what can you do to maximize value creation at each step. That will put you in a stronger position when raising. Um, but yeah, I like that. No one ever died of dilution, but they definitely died from running out of cash.
I'll add also just to that answer is, usually after you raise a round, there is kind of this expectation or hope that basically you'll have follow-on funding from the same investors who just participated, right? And having kind of a clear understanding of what their milestones, what their expectations are going to be to help unlock that next round of capital for you, and then basically making sure that you raise enough to, just in case things go sideways, still be able to kind of hit those metrics as a way of bringing
Mm,
on money. Because what you don't want to have at the end of the day is a bunch of upset investors because you raised enough to preserve your own equity stake, but not necessarily enough to just account for the unknowns that were out there, maybe pushing your timeline out, and then not being able to kind of give them the milestone hitting assurance that that you're worthy of that next tranche of money.
yeah. And the expectations comment is right on. Like, this is a thing. If anyone has ever done sales, you'll learn this right away. Um, just because you had a conversation with someone and you thought you understood what they said and they thought they understood what you said, does not mean anyone understood what happened in that conversation. Quite often, the same words mean different things to different people, and it is well worth the time and sometimes uncomfortable effort to get very clear on what those expectations are, because quite often the fights I've seen happen have been one side thought they were doing the thing the other wanted, and it turned out they misunderstood.
No, that totally makes sense. As someone who's very good at presenting clear information yourself, your pace has been fantastic, by the way.
Trying.
As someone who's hosting, very good. Completely understand where you're coming from there. Um, the next question, around the same kind of lines: what are the true odds of raising venture capital?
Oh, that is a good, you know,
This is a scary
it,
answer. I don't know. It's Halloween. This is. Go
yeah.
ahead.
I mean, it
What are your thoughts?
depends, I guess, how you calculate it. In one way, in medical device in the US, there will probably be about 600 total deals this year of like venture capital deals. So it probably works out to 1% of companies. You know, most venture funds, if you talk to them and ask like how many deals do they need to see to write a check, it's usually between 150 and 300. So that would give you a sub 1% hit rate. Um, if you add in angel and other sources of funding, that number probably goes up, but it also probably, I always get numerator and denominator mixed up, but it probably also raises the bottom of the fraction as well, right? So yeah, by and large, in venture capital, the most likely answer you're going to get is no. Um, there are things you can do to put that more in your favor, but if you think about it, for a venture fund, even if they're a pretty big one, they're only going to have 10 or 15 or 20 companies in their portfolio, right? And there's thousands of them out there to pick from. The math just says only a few make it to that point. Excuse me.
No, that totally makes sense. And along those lines, I know kind of we've talked before, a lot of early stage companies are spending a lot of money to go to some of these events that bring in the venture capital and have kind of these one-on-one tailored conversations with them. And one thing that I would always recommend to companies is do your prospecting first, understand
Mm,
kind of how those investors are planning on deploying capital, what they're looking at thematically, and then when you leave one of those conferences where a VC might have talked to 40 different companies, make sure that your follow up is prompt and fast.
yep.
Following those engagements, just because if you're not in, maybe that top 10% of conversations that a venture capitalist has had at one of these conferences, it's easy for you to get lost. So make sure you keep knocking on the door to kind of resurface your name and stay top of mind. Um,
Right on. And and I would encourage um, building your network of other entrepreneurs is really powerful, and like be generous with your contacts. The Because the odds are you're gonna get a no, there's a lot of value in as you build those relationships with investors, connecting other companies, right? Because the odds are you're gonna get a no, but now you've got a relationship. Help another company, pay it forward, they'll probably do the same thing for you, and you start to surface better warm intros. You start to get data on what's happening in the market, and you can again move the odds more in your favor to find the right investor that's going to come along with you on the journey. Like don't gate, what do they say nowadays with the kids, don't gatekeep the information.
No, absolutely. And this is another one that I see people kind of make a mistake with quite a bit. I've got a lot of options for suppliers and consultants. How do I avoid
Mm,
picking the wrong ones? And especially like in a capital intensive ecosystem like we deal with,
yeah.
and again, meeting timeline, having burn daily.
Yep.
How do companies evaluate, especially in an ecosystem, maybe not as built out as the one that you deal with there in Minneapolis? Um, how do you separate the wheat from the chaff?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing is knowledge is power. Understand the journey, and like you don't have to be able to do every part of it, but if you have some understanding of how the different pieces work, how reg works, how product development works, you can make better decisions. You can ask better questions of your potential vendors or suppliers, um, and challenge them in good ways versus having to fully rely on them, right? They may be the best at what they do and they're going to take care of you. But if you don't have that knowledge yourself, it's much harder to evaluate and to be a good partner back to them. And oh, by the way, for the vendor, right? They're talking with lots of other companies too. They only have so much time. If you have more knowledge and can be a better customer, you're going to attract better vendors, consultants, and suppliers because they'll want to spend their limited time with clients where they can have a better relationship and make more impactful work. I think the second thing I would suggest is this is where building your network of other entrepreneurs is really powerful, right? Find others who are not only at the stage you're at, but are a bit further along, and find out what their experience has been, what they wish they had known. Don't just ask for referrals to good vendors and suppliers, but ask them, what do they wish they had done different? What do they wish they had asked about? So that as you're out making evaluations, you can ask better questions. And then the third thing I would say is really work on finding partners that are fit for purpose. What you're doing as an early stage startup versus what you're doing as a commercial stage company versus what you're doing if you're the size of Medtronic are very different, even if it's fundamentally the same thing of bringing a new medical device to market. And there are different vendors, different consultants who are better suited at those different stages. Be good about asking the clients, like, what is their, or the vendors, what does their ideal client look like? If they start to describe someone that doesn't sound like you, maybe you should talk to another one. And quite often you're doing them a favor as much as you're doing yourself a favor, because if they end up taking on work from a client that's not well aligned, it's probably going to be mispriced. It's not going to be the highest quality. It's going to harm the vendor as much as it harms your business.
I'll add to that also, kind of going back to your, trust the people that have done this before, kind of reference. I completely agree. In the journey of Galen data, we've made all kinds of mistakes. Every single
Mhm.
company goes through that process, right, of learning, and we're always happy to kind of share back, what we would have done differently. And if you don't live in an ecosystem that has, these kinds of groups like the Medical Alley in Minneapolis, or Minnesota, I should say. Where you can kind of lean on them and they have kind of that umbrella of who all the people in the
Mhm.
ecosystem are and can connect you. Lean on the people that have done it. Ask them who their vendors were. Ask them who they diligenced. If they came across the name of somebody that you're speaking with, it is a small community, medtech, kind of at the end of the day.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of the people, especially those who are more seasoned, do have kind of a good feel of kind of who the players are, what the reputation looks like. And in this industry, it also seems like we have, you know, uh, a huge amount of helpful humans, right? I mean, why we
Mhm.
get into this, it's all very difficult. And at the end of the day, the goal is basically helping people, right? And
Right
so
on.
a lot of other entrepreneurs will want to see you be equally successful, along your journey as they might have been in a past one. So
Mhm.
never hesitate to ask folks. Um, Next one is not something that I know a ton about, but this
Mm.
is right up your wheelhouse, I think. 510K without a clinical study, good idea, bad idea, and I think this harkens back to kind of one of your initial slides. What are your feelings in that case?
Yeah, I think no matter what you're doing, you're going to need evidence. The level of evidence should be aligned to the market you're going after. And what I have seen companies do is really try to figure out like what is the bare minimum they can do to get market authorization. And that can work, but upfront a company should understand what is needed in the market, right? If it's something that's never been done before, low, even if the change is low, if it's truly a new way of doing something, you're probably going to need more evidence to drive adoption and drive payment. And that may mean a clinical study, it may mean something else, but I think ultimately it's bring evidence. And especially if you're getting into things where you might need new ways of getting paid or it changes some of the workflow up. Payers love to find reasons why, well, this has changed, it doesn't fit our exact policy, denied. Bring the evidence and they will listen, they will respond, and you could create a new revenue stream for the provider system, a new way of driving adoption. But it comes down to have evidence that is appropriate for the market you're going into.
Okay. No, thank you for that. I have some of these questions up here. Some of them you've already covered. Here's an interesting one. How often do you see team composition being a risk in go-to-market execution?
Very often, the
This is the 11th reason, right? Add it to the deck. Um,
yeah, I mean, it's sort
common
of the
mistakes.
it's kind of the implicit, like reason in all of the problems. Um, Ultimately, like, there's lots of invention all over Earth, like incredible invention everywhere. Uh, there are all kinds of problems in medicine that need solving. Yet, a lot of that invention never makes it to market, never helps patients. A lot of those clinical problems remain unsolved. And I would argue a big reason for that is not enough people who are capable of executing against those problems and bringing new products to market. If I'm an investor and I'm putting money into a company, I'm making a bet on the technology, on the market, and on the team. And the team is probably the highest risk thing. I can research the market, I can find experts on the technology. I mean, judging people is the most difficult skill of them all, and it's probably the highest value thing. A team that can execute, that can be very efficient, that can really drive it forward, I'm going to be much more confident in that. And where so often challenges have come up for startups has been there is a gap in the knowledge of the team. They encounter a problem that is in that gap, and they either don't know it's a problem until it's too late, or they don't know how to manage that issue, and it goes from being a small manageable issue to a crisis in the company. Um, yeah, team is like everything is team until it's not. Until team is solved, almost nothing else matters. I would say even like the dirty secret of the medtech community in Minnesota. Almost none of it here was invented here. It was technology from all over the world, from universities all over the world, from hospitals, from great people. The thing that helped build the ecosystem up here was there's lots of people who know how to take an idea, turn it into a product, and get the product adopted so that it actually benefits patients.
And I mean, and you're sitting right now in one of the meccas of that. If anyone doesn't recognize the iconic white walls behind Frank, that is Mayo Clinic in
Mayo Clinic
Rochester.
Conference Room, yeah.
That's right. Yes, the beautiful ceiling tiles, as you're all very familiar, I'm sure.
They spend the
Um,
money on patient care, not on ceiling tiles.
that's right. White paint, ceiling tiles, patient care, right, in reverse order. The We have another one from the audience here. Uh, can you please share your insights about it, and to what degree does your advice differ for international medtech companies seeing U.S. market entry, FDA approval, U.S. specific capital raises, and those kinds of things? So think of the same pain
Yeah,
points that you mentioned, but now apply them to to the overseas company trying to
yep.
tackle the largest market in the world.
Yeah, I think all the same challenges because you're coming to the US market, but then a set of new challenges. So the common things I've seen with international companies, one is they don't adjust the product or the pitch from, say, a European market or really in anywhere else on earth market to a US market. We have not just the largest, but a truly unique market, right? Because we have multiple levels of government payment, we have private payment, we have underinsurance and uninsured, very different kinds of hospitals, and we have a lot of them. Like the sheer size of it makes it different. So I see where they have things that work, say in a Western European context or a ASEAN market context, but they haven't adjusted it to here. The second, I often talk with international firms who have an assumption that there's just piles and piles of money here waiting to be spent on startups and that it's relatively easy to raise money here compared to wherever they came from. I would argue it's actually the exact opposite. The US is really good about private capital, but is not so good about the public support. The amount of money that is available from even small countries in Europe or Asia to support startups is mind blowing. Like it's orders of magnitude higher than what you find in the US for non dilutive support. The challenge that I've often seen with those companies is they get that money and then they're spending it on things that aren't creating value to bring that product to market in general, let alone into the US. And the third one that I see quite often is kind of just general business. Like there's often a perception that all we do is sue each other all day and like kind of they over index on litigation risk. And then they forget about like the compensation costs that because we don't have kind of the social benefits taxes and we don't have like health insurance and other things rolled in, they often get sticker shock once they do like fully loaded comp costs. I mean, the US is more expensive to begin with, but once they add that on, it could be like 3 or 4x more costly compared to some countries.
Got it. Here's another one. I knew that when we had you on as a guest, there was going to be questions from all angles. So tell me if this one's kind of in your wheelhouse or
Mhm.
not, or if you just have an opinion on it. What counsel would you provide to a founding team, and this is specifically kind of financial advice, about when to start paying the management team, including the founders, cash for employment and hiring people versus equity, um, you know, uh, and then I guess the question also is asking for the context of what is this in the eyes of the VC, and maybe I can maybe add some perspective here. I think maybe this is
Mhm.
kind of the VC talking about if you are starting a company, what should a founder's salary be? How much should you basically lean towards equity to bring people in versus maybe paying more money for a seasoned professional who might demand it. I don't know. Do you have any insights
Yeah.
here? Hmm.
I don't know that I could comment on specific numbers, but
Yeah.
I'd say I think definitely like you got to be able to eat, right? Like if you're going to be effectively leading a team or running a company or being part of a startup, you got to have some way to pay your bills and like affect a life. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard to focus on the startup.
There's not a
Um,
lot of ramen noodle founders in medtech. It is what it
yeah,
is, right? Yeah.
yeah. Um, Now that doesn't mean you're gonna, probably pay yourself like what you would have got paid if you were at a Medtronic or an Abbott or something like that, but you got to be able to live. Um, you also don't want to end up, putting out so much on equity that your cap table ends up being a mess. And there's all kinds of like, you hear the horrible stories of like vesting schedules gone awry and a founder leaves early and just there's all kinds of things that can go wrong. I have yet to talk to an investor that is like, no, they should just eat ramen noodles and get $0. Um, yeah,
I completely agree. They want to retain founders, right? And I
yeah,
think that to your point, right, your job is to take their investment capital and execute it as a founder to the best of your ability every single day. And
yeah.
if you're surviving on Red Bull and saltine crackers or something like that, you're just not getting
That's going to be
not getting
hard.
not getting the fuel, to drive performance forward.
And I think, but there's a self-awareness point in there. As one of the founders, like, you should be at every moment and every stage of the company asking if you're the right person, right? And have the self-awareness to acknowledge and know what you don't know. And the company, may reach a stage or may be at a stage where, you should have a different role or not have an active role. And if you're mature enough to say, my interest is I want to help patients, I want to have a successful business, have that honest discussion with yourself and with your team.
No, absolutely. This one is a bit broad and it's kind of more of a
Mhm.
personal opinion question. But I
Always
think from
got
your
an
vantage
opinion.
point, you've probably seen a whole gamut of these kinds of things, and I'm sure you have opinion on this also. Um, so it's curious about your opinions on AI in medtech.
Mm. So I am old enough to remember bits of the dot-com bubble, and at the time, everyone said they were an internet company. No one says they're an internet company anymore, right? Like everything's internet. I think AI is the same thing. It is an underlying technology that is having huge impact already and will have significant impact on healthcare. Um, but I think it is an underlying technology, right? It is not the game itself. It'd be like saying, um, I don't know, you're a plastic washer company. You wouldn't do that, right? Like it's
Hmm.
a component that enables your product. So AI may be your product or a component of your product, but I think over time, I think a few years we'll get to a point where AI will be part of lots of things, but it won't be the thing in front.
Yeah, and I would agree. So from the Galen data perspective, obviously we enable these kinds of companies to go to market very quickly because we're housing a lot of that data and running algorithms
Hmm.
kind of adjacent to that data is something that we specialize in. And I would say right now there's a lot of people kind of going over generic layers of AI that involve medtech,
Yeah.
and in that space there is a ton of overlap. And I think it's just a question of kind of when it all shakes out, kind of who are going to be the winners that are left over with kind of the best ideas. Now, when it comes to device specific, AI, or machine learning algorithms, we see a lot of companies even today, kind of like Frank mentioned at the onset, device companies that weren't traditionally connected, right? Now
Hmm.
having this onus to basically aggregate their data for future use. They don't know what they want to do with it yet, but basically they want the data as soon as it starts leaving the device to start building up this data lake that they can then go in and kind of analyze later. So I think that basically there's a huge amount of future potential for kind of where these things
Hmm.
are going to go. People are starting to think along those lines when it comes to data aggregation. That
Right on.
layer of I talked about kind of very very common ideas that kind of layer on top of medtech in general. TBD on kind of where that goes. But I do think that basically AI, at least as it exists right now, which is complex decision tree, isn't going away really anytime soon. It's more a question of just kind of seeing how it shapes. Um,
Hmm. Right
um,
on.
as you can see on the screen right now, here's some additional information about Galen. More importantly, how to contact Frank is there in the bottom right. Um, let's see. Any other kind of last questions? There's a bunch of them. There's too many here to really go through, but I will forward these over to Frank, and then Frank, if you see
Please.
anyone that we didn't touch here, you can go ahead and respond personally offline. Well, offline here. Um, and I think that from that perspective and the amount of time, maybe we can fit one more in really quickly here. Let's see here. This one's also kind of broad. What is the most underrated aspect in go-to-market that you may have seen? And it might just fit one of those slides that you said.
Underrated.
Is there one that basically like everybody overlooks this maybe, or something like that? And feel free to take some time to think about it. We're
You know,
surprising with these things on the fly.
I mean, the reason it was the first slide, the one that gets overlooked so often, and it is so foundational, is just like, is there a market for what you're doing? And
Mhm.
sometimes you can create new markets, right? That does happen, but that's hard. And even when you create a new market, it's still you had identified some latent need and activated it. I meet so many companies every year and have for 20 years where they have something that they can do something different, but they can't tell you why different matters and who it matters to, right? Like maybe we don't need another way to do X. Maybe we do, but it's incumbent on you to articulate why and to who that matters. So that like the most foundational piece, I swear to God, probably half to two-thirds of the companies I talk to each year end up struggling to articulate why they are different in a way that matters to someone who can actually drive patient care and product adoption.
Agreed. I think that, doubling down on that, really know how to address your TAM, right? Your total addressable
Hmm.
market. You're going to need that data when you start raising even those kind of early rounds of funding, because people obviously want a large opportunity, right? But
Hmm.
make sure that you can back that up with figures, because as soon as you put out something publicly, that math will stick with you through all of the subsequent decks and all the subsequent asks for more money that you might have from your investors. And if your TAM goes from gigantic to very narrow very quickly, it'll cause a lot of pause with folks.
Hmm.
So show how you did the math.
Right on.
Yeah. With that, I'd love to say a very sincere thank you to Frank for joining us today. I'll get all these excess questions, in
Thank
his
you.
in his email inbox to respond to, and yeah, sincerely appreciate all of your time for joining, and looking forward to the next webinar that'll be happening in November with NNIT, which is a
Nice.
European design firm. Yeah, very very large firm over there. So yeah, thank you so much, Frank. I don't know if you want to say
Thank
goodbye
you,
quickly
Alex.
to all the people who joined, and yeah, you're very welcome, obviously. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
everyone. Really appreciate what you do.
All right, take care, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.